everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here on the last day. My name is Brianne Tomaszewski. I'm at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I'm super excited to be chairing this panel alongside DaWalt from the Weissman Center. And we are going to be talking about social, vocational, and service experiences of adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and thinking about it in the context of the socioecological framework. So to give us a nice little reminder of what that is, I just wanted to share before we dive into our wonderful presentations, and also to make this kind of a game for you all to get some energy up. I want you to think about which levels of the socioeconomical framework, or socioecological, framework are being talked about in our talks today. So we'll talk about that at the end. But we got so little quiz for you. I'll give you a high five, and you can see my little baby with her smiles later if you guys get the answers right. But we'll be talking about across the adult being at the center of the model, alongside the individual, the microsystems, the mesosystems, exosystems, and macrosystems. So thinking about how we conduct research using this framework, and then what the implications of that research is. So I'm thrilled to be presenting or with these presentations today that will be going first with Dr. Julie Taylor and talking from Vanderbilt University Medical Center. So we'll go ahead and get started.
Everybody hear me okay? If you can, if this goes down, this will be me. I'm not Natalie Libster, I'm Julie Taylor, and I'm really excited to be able to present some of the work that she's been leading in our lab, looking at dimensions of social support and quality of life among autistic adults. And for those of you that are here hoping to see her, she will be at INSERN. She had a baby recently, and it was a little too soon to travel here, but she's very excited to see all of you at INSERN in a month. So why are we thinking about social support, particularly when it comes to autistic adults? And we know from decades and decades and decades of research in the general population that social support is really important to mental health in a whole lot of different groups of populations. And there has been some work on social support in autistic samples, and those studies have suggested that instrumental support, so getting help with things, and emotional support, getting that type of support is associated with better mental health in autistic samples. But these are only two components of many components of social support that we could be thinking about. In the general population, there are a lot of other dimensions of social support that are also associated with well-being. And these might also be important for autistic adults. In the next slide, I'm going to talk through what some of those other dimensions might be. So if we are really wanting to think about social support as a way to intervene to improve mental health in autistic adults, then I think we need to be taking a really wide look at all the different parts of social support and the different dimensions to be understanding which of them seem to be most important for mental health that we might want to be thinking about as potential targets for intervention. So in the work that I'm going to be talking about here, we've taken the perspective and borrowed from the convoy model of social relations. This is a model of social support, again, that has been used for decades and decades. But it really talks about social support in sort of three different aspects. So the first is the structure and the composition of the support network. And there are a couple of pieces of that that we'll be measuring and talking about. One is the size of the network. So how many people do you have in your social support network that you get support from? The diversity of that network. So how many different types of people do you have in that network? So this is thinking about diversity a little bit differently than how we often talk about it. But it sort of is like, is your whole network friends? Is your whole network family? Or is it made up of different types of relationships in your network? And then how frequently a person interacts with the people in their network. And in the general population, all of these indices are associated with well-being, health, and quality of life among people. The next aspect in the convoy model is convoy support and function. And these are things like, what kind of instrumental support do you get from people in your network, and what kind of emotional support do you get from people in your network? And as I already mentioned, these aspects are associated with mental health in autistic populations and well associated with mental health in all kinds of other populations as well. And then the last aspect is the quality of a person's network, which we'll be thinking about in terms of how satisfied a person is with their network. So when we're thinking about social support and sort of the different aspects, we had a couple of different research questions that we wanted to look at relative to autistic adults. the first thing that we wanted to do was take this convoy model, looking at all these different dimensions of networks, and really just describe them in a sample of autistic adults. In the sample, what does the structure of people's networks look like? What is the quality of their networks? And how do they seem to function in a sample of autistic adults? The next thing that we wanted to do is we wanted to take these aspects, particularly of structure and function, and understand how they're associated with quality. So are there certain aspects of networks that seem to be related to being more satisfied with your network? If you have more different types of people in your network, or just bigger networks in general, for example, does a person tend to be more satisfied with their network? Next, we were interested in how all of these different indices were associated with psychological quality of life. So we looked at, among autistic adults, whether aspects of their structure, the function of their network, and the quality of the network were sort of independently associated with psychological quality of life. So this is more of a direct effect, I would say, or a direct association of social support with quality of life. And then the last analysis that I'm going to talk about, so there's kind of a lot here, is a buffering hypothesis. And again, in the general population, there's decades of research that shows that social support can really buffer the negative impacts of stressors on health, quality of life, and mental health. And we were wondering whether that would also be the case in the sample of autistic adults. And particularly, if so, what were the specific aspects of networks that might buffer the impact of stressors on quality of life? All right, so to look at this, we used data from the first time point of a longitudinal study focused on employment stability and mental health. This is a study that DaWalt and I are leading. We are deep into this study right now, so you can be expecting to hear much more about this study over the next few years at Gatlinburg as we get a chance to look at our longitudinal data. This is baseline data here. We recruited and collected data from 199 autistic adults. We were shooting for 200 and we got so close. I need to just say 200 because we consented 200 people, right? So we'll just say 200. 146 of them had data on the measures that we'll be talking about today. So that's who's in the sample. All of the autistic adults in this sample had an autism diagnosis. We did this because services was one of the things that we were interested in looking at. All of the autistic adults needed to be able to self-report. So I think this is really important to keep in mind. We did all of our data collection virtually. We offered accommodations as much as we could, and we did not limit it based on IQ per se, but the adults need to be able to give us at least some self-report data. And then we also collected data from informants as well, which sort of let us include people in the sample that maybe we were getting a little bit less information from them and we got more information from an informant. This is just the demographics of the adults in the sample, so about 2/3 male, mostly adults who are cisgender, primarily a white sample, 85%. About just under 30% of the adults were in a post-secondary education program at the first time point of the study. And not surprisingly, because we required adults to be able to self-report, our sample is primarily adults who do not have an intellectual disability, although we do have a few who do work in the study. Okay. In terms of our social support interview that we did, again, we used a modified convoy model. So we asked the adults to list up to 10 people who were close to them or who were important to them. So they could have listed 1, they could have listed 0, they could have listed 10. And for each of those people, we went through a series of questions to try to understand sort of their role in the adult's life. So we asked what their relationship was to that person. These are the different categories here. We asked if they had interacted with that person over the last 7 days in terms of hanging out or going somewhere, talking or texting on the telephone, or doing sort of online interaction. We asked if they had talked to that person in the last 7 days about a problem, so that was our indicator of emotional support. And then we asked if they'd received help from that person over the last 7 days, and that was our indicator of instrumental support. And we asked that about each person in the network. And then when they had gone through their network, at the end we asked sort of this global question about how satisfied they were with their relationships in general across their network. And people could respond from a 1, which is highly dissatisfied, to a 5, which is highly satisfied. And from that interview is where we derived our measures of network, dimensions of the social support network. So in terms of structure and composition, we looked at the number of people that they reported in their network. We looked at the number of diverse relationships in their network. So is their whole network friends, or is there a friend, family member, sibling, etc.? And I'll report some of that data. And we looked at the number of people in their network that they reported they had interacted with over the past week. In terms of support and function, we looked at the number of people who had helped the adult in the past week and the number of people that the adult had talked to about a problem. And then our indicator of quality was satisfaction with the network. Our outcome was the psychological score on the World Health Organization Quality of Life Scale, so the psychological scale. And I mentioned that we were going to look at social support as a buffer of stress or life events. So from every adult, we collected a measure of personal stress. So it's a 22-item checklist that just measures major life events that could have happened in the person's life over the last year, positive and negative, but as we all know, positive and negative events can both be stressful. So these are things like getting a new job, moving, having a major health problem, having a significant decrease in your income, having a significant increase in your income, etc. So we asked these questions, the adults told us yes or no, if that had happened over the last year, and then we have a sum of the number of significant changes or stressors they had had. And then in each of our models, we controlled for the following factors: the adult's age, their biological sex, whether they were a gender minority, and their IQ. So I'm not going to present sort of the covariant coefficients, although I can tell you what they are as we go through this just to keep things kind of clean, but we did control for that in all of our models. Okay, so A1 was just describing the networks of this sample of 146 autistic adults. And every adult had at least one person in their social network. And almost every adult had interacted with at least one person in their network over the past week. 82% received help from at least one person over the last week, and about 3/4 had talked to at least one person about a problem. About 85% of the adults reported either being satisfied or very satisfied with their networks. The block below here just shows the most frequent responses and the medians across each of these different indicators. The most frequent response was 10. So adults most often used sort of every opportunity we gave them to report people in their networks. The median number of people in the adults network was 7. And I think the other thing that's interesting here is that the mode and the median for diverse relationships was 3. 3 different types of people in their network. I'll show you who they were. So adults most frequently reported parents in their network. After that was friends, siblings, and then other relatives. And then less frequently, adults reported professionals, in-laws, or spouses, and none of the adults in the sample reported children or ex-spouses in the network. Most of them didn't have children, but a few did. Okay, next we look to see which aspects of structure and function were independently associated with adult satisfaction with their network. And what we found was that adults who reported having interacted with more people in their network over the past 7 days were more satisfied with their network. The number of people, diverse relationships, and our indicators of function were not independently associated with satisfaction, which was a little bit surprising to us because those are highly associated with satisfaction in the general population. Next, we wanted to look at the associations between each of our aspects of social networks and psychological quality of life. So now we take social network quality and we put it in as a predictor here as one of the potential predictors of psychological quality of life, along with our other aspects of networks. And we found that 2 of our different aspects of networks were significantly associated with psychological quality of life. One was expected, which was that for people who were more satisfied with their network, they reported higher psychological quality of life. The other was less expected, and that was the more people in their network that the adult talked to about a problem, the lower scores on psychological quality of life they reported. So more emotional support was associated with lower psychological quality of life. Which we thought was interesting, right? Sometimes, our sort of most interesting findings are the ones that we really want to delve into a little bit deeper. So we had this thought and this hypothesis, which was, is it that people who have more problems are the ones who are talking to more people about the problems, right? And is it perhaps the problems are the stressors that are driving this association and not the talking to people about problems that's driving the association? So we first started out by just looking at the associations between stressors, the number of people they talk to about a problem, and psychological quality of life. and not surprisingly, people who reported more stressors reported talking to more people about their problems and stressors, and also reported lower psychological quality of life. So the next thing that we did is we took the model that we had just run and we added the number of personal stressors into that model as another independent variable. And when we did that, the number of people that the adult talked to about a problem was no longer a statistically significant predictor of psychological quality of life. So I think what this is telling us is that at least in these direct effect analysis, this effect between emotional support and psychological quality of life is probably driven by the fact that people who are talking to more people about problems have more problems. Well, the next thing that we wanted to look at then was this buffering hypothesis. So let me go back to this one here. And so to try to determine which aspects of social support we wanted to think about as potentially buffering the effects of stress, we started out by looking at the two aspects of social support that were independently related to psychological quality of life on their own. So that was the number of people the adult talked to about a problem and satisfaction with their network. Okay. And we found that the interaction between the number of people that the adult talked to about a problem and their stressors significantly predicted psychological quality of life. So I just presented to you all the analyses showing the direct effects of stressors and kind of explained all that. That's probably less important now that we know that they interact with each other. This is sort of the process that we went through to that. And let me show you what that interaction looks like. So you can see this great. So this shows the association between stressors and psychological quality of life at different levels of emotional support, basically. So the blue line are people who didn't talk to anybody about problems. The green line are people who talked to 5 people about their problems, which was 1 standard deviation above the mean here. And what you can see is that line is a lot steeper for people who aren't talking to anybody about their problems. So the association between stressors and psychological quality of life is stronger when people aren't talking to other people about their problems. And that association is attenuated when the autistic adults are talking to other people about their problems. So it does seem like talking to people about your problems are buffering the impact of stressors on psychological quality of life. We also looked at the interaction between someone's satisfaction with their network and the number of personal stressors, and that was not statistically significant. So it seems like satisfaction with a person's network has more of a direct effect, or at least sort of a direct association with psychological quality of life. Okay. So to sum this up, what we found is that autistic adults who were more satisfied with their social networks reported higher psychological quality of life. And this is maybe pretty intuitive, except we didn't find indicators, we didn't find associations between a whole lot of other variables that we might have expected to find associations with, like size and support and diversity. And I think what this could mean is that social networks might look a little bit different in autistic adults. And I'm not saying necessarily different between autistic adults and in adults who are not autistic, but I'm saying within autistic adults, I think what people want for their networks may vary a lot within this group. And so we may be wanting to think really carefully about meeting a person's individual needs instead of doing things like, well, let's make sure you have more friends, for example. We found that receiving emotional support may protect autistic adults from the negative mental health outcomes associated with personal stressors, but I think what's really important to remember here is this is a cross-sectional study, right? So we're telling you what we think are the predictors and what we think are the outcomes here, but we need to follow people over time to really understand how this unfolds and what seems to be the driving factors and what seems to be the outcomes, and we are going to have the data to do that, which we're really excited about. I think the other thing to think really carefully about that I think is really important in autism research and in this study too is who is our sample, right? So these are primarily adults without intellectual disability, and I just want to make sure that we all are always keeping that in mind, especially with autism research where there's such a huge range on the autism spectrum. We need to do research with people with intellectual disability so we understand if these processes work the same way. And again, I think I already kind of said this. I think our findings highlight that perhaps interventions to sort of increase objective aspects of networks may be less effective in this group for increasing psychological health and really trying to understand what that individual person needs in looking to sort of fulfill those social needs, which sounds really intuitive when I say it, but it's not always how we think about our interventions when we're doing this work. All right, thank you very much.
And I will speak for Julie to say that we are very thankful adults and their performance in our study, and NIH that is supporting us. And so we're very grateful to our funder. Now I'm going to move into a different way of thinking about support using a similar set of participants. So I'm going to talk about sources of support for activities of daily living for autistic adults. And as just a little bit of background, we know that daily living skills are really important for all of us. Particularly, we're learning more about how these skills may be important for adolescents and also adults. We also know that there's a lot of variation for autistic individuals and their daily living skills, but in general we see that autistic adults have lower levels of adaptive behavior relative to their neurotypical peers, and often adaptive behavior in general, daily living skills specifically, tend to be lower relative to cognitive ability for autistic individuals. And so we think it's an important construct to study, and it's not sort of part of the diagnostic understanding of autism. So what we're going to do for this study is look at sources of support for autistic adults in completing activities of daily living, including them completing them themselves. So 3 questions to look at. What are the sources of support for autistic adults? And for this particular paper, we're looking at those who don't have a co-occurring intellectual disability and completing activities of daily living. Are there differences in the amount of support for those who are living with their parents versus those who are not living with their parents but are living elsewhere? And then are there differences in mental and physical health outcomes for those who have what we're considering unmet needs in the areas of activities of daily living compared to those who have adequate support? So either they're completing these tasks themselves or they have help. And again, we're using autistic adults drawn from a larger ongoing longitudinal study. This is from our baseline wave of data collection, and I know Julie and I are just tied up because we so want to use longitudinal data, but for this presentation, we're giving you the cross-sectional data. And for this paper, focusing on autistic adults and without a co-occurring intellectual disability who were able to self-report on all of our measures of interest. So the activities of daily living and our outcomes were all self-report of the autistic adults. On average, the adults in the sample were 26. Most were male and white. About 60% were co-residing with their parents, and over a quarter already had achieved a bachelor's degree. And again, we know the spectrum is really heterogeneous, so I want us to keep in mind who it is I'm talking about when we're talking about these findings today. We used the Weissman Activities of Daily Living scale, and we had the autistic adults rate their own independence across different activities of daily living, so they could indicate they did these tasks independently, with help, or not at all. And we divided the tasks into household tasks, so that's setting and clearing the table, washing dishes, making a bed, personal care tasks, which were dressing, bathing, grooming, food preparation, so making simple foods, cooking, preparing a complete meal, and then instrumental activities such as running errands, doing daily finances, scheduling, planning appointments, those types of activities. And so when we think about independence and adulthood, all of these activities are things that are relevant and have pretty good base value. So the autistic adults indicated their level of independence, and if they weren't completing a task independently, they indicated who helped them with those tasks. And they could select from a range of supports, and they weren't mutually exclusive. So you could say you get help from all these sources. So the mother, the father, a sibling, another relative, a neighbor or a friend, an informal paid support. So sort of like a neighbor mowing your lawn, a disability-specific service, a general service like Uber, and then they also could say that they weren't receiving help from anyone in completing the activity. And then we classified those who weren't doing these tasks independently and weren't getting help is having an unmet ADL need. And then we had 3 outcome measures. So we were interested in health as well as mental health, and we used their own rating of their physical health on a 4-point scale from poor to excellent. This type of self-help, rating of health is widely used in sort of the general adult literature and highly predictive of morbidity and mortality. And then we use the Beck scales for depression and anxiety. So first, I just want to give a little descriptive data about the skills that these autistic adults were doing. And here, again, these are the sort of categories or subscales of the activities of daily living. Almost all of the sample were fully independent and personal care tasks. Oh, they're not labeled correctly. The grooming is what they were fully independent in. And then the food preparation was next, followed by household tasks and instrumental tasks. And across all of the different items, 15% of the sample was fully independent. So that meant that they were doing all of the tasks themselves. Okay, so our first research question. What are the sources of support among autistic adults without intellectual disability when completing activities of daily living? And here we go. So across all tasks, and this is the first column in red, you can see that, and these are the different sources of support. So across all the different tasks on the activities of daily living, 83% of adults were receiving support from some family member. And again, these were the adults who were needing help or weren't fully independent. The most common source of support was the mother. So almost 3/4 of the autistic adults were getting help from their moms in completing these daily tasks. Next after mom was the father, and then siblings, and then some other relatives. We also looked at non-family support. So across all tasks, a little over 40% were receiving support from non-family members. Most often a neighbor or a friend. I want to point out there's very little support from disability services for this group. And I think this has to do with the fact that these were individuals without co-occurring intellectual disability. And I think that this is a problem and how sort of we determine eligibility for adult services. And I also want to point out, I remember people could say that no one was helping them with a task. And so when we looked across all the tasks, over 30% of these autistic adults had an unmet need. So they didn't have any support or help for at least one of the tasks. And again, I think we have a lot to think about our adult service system and how are we helping autistic adults get what they need. When we look at personal care, again, almost all of them were independent, and personal care, which is the bathing and the grooming and the dressing. If they were getting help, it was from the moms. Okay, next, food preparation. So that would be like making like easy mac or preparing a complete meal. If folks were getting support and food prep, it almost always was from the family and the mom. The mom was really the one making the food. Very little non-family support. Again, you can see that 10% were getting non-family support for food. When we think about household tasks, again, the household tasks are things like setting the table, cleaning, making beds, those types of activities. Over half of the sample was getting support for family and getting the house clean. And this also could be like home repairs, things like that. And about 20% were getting support from non-family members and their activities at home. And I want to point out again, almost 30% had no one helping with some of these household tasks. And we can think more about that. And then finally, when we think about instrumental activities, so these are things like scheduling appointments, managing your money, transportation. These tasks, overwhelmingly the family is helping with these these tasks, and only about 30% of autistic adults are receiving support from a non-family source for completing these tasks. I also think this is interesting when we think about adult services that might be provided to those who are autistic and have intellectual disability. These types of things like transportation, et cetera, are often provided by disability services. But in this case, it really seems to be the family that's providing that source of support. So now, our question. Mothers really were the most common source of support for these autistic adults in completing their activities of daily living. And the support from family was dramatically lower than non-family sources of support. And again, just very little disability-related services were being received for these activities of daily living. We're not talking about voc rehab or post-secondary supports where maybe there's other supports, but when it comes to sort of the activities of daily living, these instrumental supports, and household tasks, it really is falling on the mothers. And do we see differences in these patterns for those who live at home and maybe like with their parents versus not? Because maybe it's all driven by they're in their mom's house and their mom does all the cooking and all the cleaning. How nice. I wish I lived with my mom who kept my house clean for me. So maybe that is what's going on. And we do find evidence of that. So here, the blue bars are for autistic adults that are living with their parents, and the orange bars are those who don't live with their parents. So for the most part, they were living independently or with a roommate or a spouse. And so we see that there are big differences where moms and dads and siblings and actually neighbors are providing more support if they're living together. However, if you slow your eyes down, you will see that even among those who they are not living with their moms, the moms are still providing supporting 1.5 activities of daily living. So that's a lot of support for someone who isn't living with you to help get these tasks done. And overwhelmingly, the mom is the highest category for both those who do and don't live at home. I will say that for those who aren't living with their parents, they're more likely to receive these disability services or be using Uber, those kinds of things, but it's pretty low, again, compared to how much support the mom is providing. And again, these are the autistic adults themselves saying that who's helping them, and we also have data from the informant that looks pretty similar. So next, compared to those who didn't live with their parents, autistic adults that were co-residing did get more support from family members and friends. Those who they got slightly less disability services, but again, everybody was pretty low on those disability services. And moms really are the main source of support. So finally, you might remember like 30% of folks had what we thought of as unmet need. So they weren't independently completing some of these tasks and they didn't have help for them. So is there a difference between those who are getting help for their ADLs and those who aren't? And it is an overwhelming yes. So this is a really large effect where we see for those with unmet ADL needs, worse self-rated health, as well as higher levels of depression and depressive symptoms and higher levels of anxiety symptoms. And this is a pretty big effect. We've played around with different subgroups and controls, and it seems pretty robust. That those with unmet need really are experiencing poorer health. So in conclusion, we found, again, this is just cross-sectional data with our somewhat small sample, but that mothers are a major source of support for autistic adults without intellectual disability across all these daily tasks. And we didn't find much non-family support across these tasks, particularly what Julie and I might think of like for services, right? They're not really getting services for getting these tasks done. And you might think, well, maybe that's okay. Maybe these tasks aren't that important. But having unmet needs is associated with much poorer health. So I think that these tasks actually either the tests themselves or some other third variable is important here. And so we really need longitudinal data to try to understand if these patterns change over time. Again, most of these adults were 26, so we don't know in this particular group what things might look like as they age. And we also don't know the direction of effects at all. Like, we have no comment on directionality or cause right now because it's cross-sectional. And so maybe some of these health outcomes like depression, maybe that is linked to not getting help, or maybe not getting help is linked to depression. But all I know is it seems like there's something important that's going on here. Obviously, want to thank our team and NIH that has supported us, but mostly for the autistic adults who give so much. And we contact them every 6 months. They are giving us a lot of information, and they are so generous and really dedicated, and I'm really grateful. So I will stop there.
Hello, my name is Hayden. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about the impact of the living situation and support needs on service use and housing preferences for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So it is known that the evolving support needs for individuals with IDD across their lifespans are not being met with appropriate services, especially when we're talking about adulthood. Many may be familiar with the term of the service cliff, describing the period in which an individual with IDD is transitioning out of the school system and into adult life. This can be a critical period, especially for those who do receive services while they are in school. So grade schools are often able to provide a variety of services all in one building. So a student can come to school every day, work on coursework with their teacher, socialize with their classmates. The school might have things like art or sports, other extracurriculars. They may be receiving speech therapy or physical therapy. And then of course, for a lot of our students with IDD, they also have individualized education plans where they're able to engage in that important goal setting activities with academic personnel and with their family members. So what a lot of these students find and their families find when they are transitioning out of the school system is that all of these services that they used to receive all in one building are now spread out across their community. So these services might still exist for these individuals in adulthood, but now we have this extra factor of navigation to contend with when we're talking about actually accessing these services themselves. And so today we'll talk about some of the services that do exist for adults with IDD, but may be underutilized for a variety of reasons. For example, service utilization for this population may be impacted by living situation. Past research has shown that our adults with IDD who are living with their family members, for example, are accessing preventative healthcare services less than those in other living situations. So this could include those who are living independently or with a roommate or with paid support. Support needs may be another factor that is impacting service utilization here. So for our adults with different levels of support needs, low or moderate or high, and for our adults with high support needs, they may have this obstacle of expressing choice and want and need when it comes to the services that they are accessing. So for example, an adult with IDD and higher support needs may have a goal for themselves for employment in adulthood, but are unable to access the vocational services that can support them in that success because they were unable to express that desire to be on this path in the first place. So these are some of the things that we already know may be impacting service utilization, and in order to investigate this further, the UNC Teach Autism program collaborated with a local organization called Hope NC, who is really trying to build up these communities for adults with IDD and addressing these relevant questions of where will our adults with IDD live when their aging caregivers are no longer able to care for them. And we did have 2 questions for the current project. We were wondering if living situation impacts service use and housing preferences. So are adults with IDD living with their family members? Are they accessing services differently? Are they thinking about housing differently than those living with roommates or by themselves or with paid support? We're also wanting to know support needs, level of support needs. So if our adult with IDD is at a lower level of support needs or needs a little bit more support, needs a lot of support, if they are using services differently, if they are in different housing situations compared to these other support needs groups. And for the current project, we did administer an online survey to 82 caregivers of adults with IDD in North Carolina and asked them a lot of questions about their loved one with IDD. We also had 13 semi-structured interviews that we did with our adults with IDD themselves as well. This is just a little breakdown of our sample. Most of our adults with IDD who participated in our interviews or were being described by the caregivers via that online survey were white and most were male. Our age range was 18 to 54. We had a mean age of about 29 years old. And across the sample, we had multiple diagnoses that were reported, including autism, intellectual disability, Down syndrome, or cerebral palsy. Many of these diagnoses were co-occurring as well. In terms of the survey questions that we were asking to our caregivers of their adults with IDD, the ones that were most relevant to the current project fell into 3 different categories. One of them was about support needs. So we were talking about a lot of different activities in adult life. We were wanting to know from the caregiver if their adult with IDD needs no extra support with that activity, some support, or total support. And these questions really spanned a lot of different activities that could come up in adulthood, everything from managing finances, cooking and cleaning, maintaining personal physical health, dental health, personal safety, and socialization. We are also wanting to know from the caregiver perspective, what was their vision for preferred future housing for their adult with IDD? And these were questions like, what kind of range of ages do you want your adult with IDD to live near? Do you see them in an owned or rented residence? What size home do you think your adult with IDD would want? And does your adult with IDD themselves express interest in living on their own? And then finally, we also asked questions about the services that were currently being received by the adult with IDD and what types of services were being provided. So these were a bunch of select all questions where the caregivers could go down and indicate the services that were most relevant to their current situation. And these are some of the types of services that we asked about, but there are a lot more that are not explicitly stated on the slide as well. And so for our interviews with our adults with IDD, the questions most relevant to the current project fell into 2 categories. First, about their current living situation. So where do you live right now? What type of outdoor space do you have there? Do you have any special things in your neighborhood? And this could be amenities like a pool or a fitness center. Who do you live with right now? What type of places do you enjoy going to? And then we also wanted to get their perspective as well on their preferred future housing. So if you could live anywhere at all, where would it be? What type of home would you have? What type of outdoor space would you have? What would you like to live near? And for our interviews with our adults with IDD, we did have a visual component as well. So whenever we were asking these questions about where they live or what kinds of things they would like around them, we always had a visual cue to make sure that we were all on the same page. And our adults with IDD, depending on their communication style, could verbally answer with these 3 choices, or as indicated on the screen, they could give us hand signals. They could also point or otherwise indicate to the choice that was most relevant to their situation. So once the data were collected, we saw that about 33% of our adults with IDD were living without family members. So again, independently with roommates with paid support. And then 67% were living with family members or relatives. And we did find that our adults with IDD who are living with family members were significantly less likely to use services overall compared to those living without relatives. And that's a 0.036 value there. However, when we consider only the non-residential services that were being utilized, we no longer saw that difference between our groups. This is a visualization of some of the results that were posted on the last slide, where it's clear that you can see that our individuals with IDD who are living without their relatives are using more of those services than those living with relatives. And so keeping in mind that a significant portion of the service use could be accounted for by residential services, we were still interested in looking at what other types of services were being more frequently used by our adults with IDD in different living situations. And so as you can see here, some of these services that were being used more by our adults with IDD living without relatives were things like employment services, community living services, community transition services. And for some of these services where we're seeing the opposite trend and they're being used more by those living with family members, these are services like respite services and day supports. This is an unsurprising finding in the context of these living situations for these adults with IDD. We were also wanting to look at any differences between our different groups of support needs. So we ended up calculating a mean support needs score for each of our adults and then categorize them into either low or moderate or high support needs. And this graph shows that our three groups were pretty well represented, with it's well represented equally, with our high support needs groups being slightly overrepresented here. For our low support needs groups, we did find that they were more likely to have no unpaid supervision than those with high support needs. And unpaid supervision will be things like supervision provided by parents or relatives or family friends, where their presence is not necessarily being paid for in their life with the adult with IDD. We also found that they were more likely to have unpaid supervision several hours per week, specifically compared to those with high support needs who might need that 24/7 supervision. And so this graph summarizes some of those findings, where we can see that we're looking at the frequency of our unpaid service use specifically. We can see the 3 levels of support needs categorized here, and we can see that for that several hours a week usage for that unpaid service use, our low support needs group is using that a lot more, and our high support needs group is more using that 24 hours per day of unpaid service use. And while we did not find any particular differences among these groups for paid service usage, one thing that is important to note here is that our folks who were answering questions about their paid service use were reporting more frequently that they did not use any paid services at all. And that's especially compared to when we are looking at our unpaid service use. We did not have that many people tell us, no, we don't use any unpaid services. But that is not the case for our paid services. For our high support needs groups, we did see that they were more likely to receive services via the innovations waiver than our other support needs groups. The innovations waiver is a Medicaid resource that is specific to individuals with IDD living in North Carolina, offering home and community-based services that are provided by local managed care organizations. And in order to qualify for the waiver, individuals must meet the requirements for living in an intermediate care facility, but choose to use the waiver services instead of living in a facility setting. And some of the services that can be provided through this waiver are things like assistive technology, community living supports, navigation supports, day services, and more. So we also applied an inductive thematic analysis to our semi-structured interviews that we conducted with our adults with IDD. And there are many interesting themes that emerged, 2 of which are most relevant to the current project, and the first one of which is independence. So on this topic, our adults with IDD were telling us things like, well, I would like to live independently in an apartment with roommates. Being able to be on my own, being able to gain my independence fully back is the most important to future housing. What's really important about these 2 quotes in particular is that when our adults with IDD are talking about goals of living independently, they're not necessarily talking about living alone. So this person wants to live independently, but specifically mentions roommates being there in their vision for their future housing. And for this person, we ask them what makes them feel happy in their home. And they're saying things like, I have a lot more independence, I can go to bed when I want, I can wake up when I want, I can choose what to eat and when to eat it. And this just really highlights that some of these little things about living independently that may be taken for granted in other situations are really important to our adults with IDD when they are thinking about their vision for their future housing. Another theme that was relevant to the current project is access to services. So on this topic, our adults with IDD were saying things like, I would like to live in an apartment for adults with disabilities in a public transportation area. So this person is wanting to live with others who perhaps have similar experiences, but not necessarily in a caregiver role, and being able to access transportation services as well. For this next quote, I will preface and say that we did administer these interviews to adults with IDD. Sometimes they would have their caregiver with them for some extra support. So for some of these questions, we were able to get a caregiver's perspective as well. Just relevant to this quote where our caregiver is saying, I hear that people are doing it for themselves. There are lots of families that have gone in on, okay, I've got a special needs child, you've got a special needs child, and set them up together. But then the various family members cross over and checking to make sure that things are done. So this caregiver describing a situation in which there are potentially multiple adults with IDD living together, but the housing situation is such that it is accessible to these other folks, these family members coming in and still making sure that everything is okay. And especially for the second half of this quote where the caregiver is saying, but then the various family members cross over and checking in. could point to this want and need for some housing services for our adults with IDD living apart from their family members to do that checking in and take some of that burden off of our caregivers who are all going in on this together. And so with these two quotes here, our adults with IDD are really just emphasizing that accessible services are essential when they're considering their future housing, which is consistent with previous research. So returning back to our research questions, wanting to know if living situation impacts service use and housing preferences. We saw that yes, both of these are true for this sample. So living without relatives was associated with that increase in service use, and living with relatives, a lot of our IDDs, adults with IDD who were in this living situation did express that desire to live independently in our semi-structured interviews. This really underscores the importance of continuing to explore these non-familial housing options for our adults with IDD, hopefully in order to facilitate both community participation through increased service use and perhaps self-determination with the ability to live independently in adulthood. We're also wondering if support needs impact service use and housing preferences, and we saw that this was true for services but not for housing. So across our support needs groups, we didn't find any significant differences in what they were telling us about their current or future living situations. But for our service needs, we did find that, for example, our high support needs group was associated with that usage of the innovations waiver compared to other support needs groups. And so for our future direction, definitely our findings here continue to pose questions about how we can increase accessibility and utilization of these non-familial housing options for our adults with IDD. And based on these results, we're also wondering if the innovations waiver could be further leveraged in order to get these, especially these adults with high support needs, where they want to go in terms of their goals for their future housing as well, and potentially living independently or apart from family members. When we're thinking about our non-familial living situations, future research could investigate more how community participation and self-determination may look differently for these living situations compared to others. And overall, there's just this impetus to definitely increase access not only to our residential services, but to all services that are relevant to adulthood for individuals with IDD in order to optimize some of these outcomes for adulthood that we're wanting to see. Thank you so much for your time. If you were interested in the full housing report by the UNC Teach Autism Program at Hope NC, we've got a QR code for that here. That's it.
All right. Hi, my name is Allie, and I'm excited to be presenting data on using GIS and GPS service needs, daily living skills, and the quality of life for individuals with IDD. I'm presenting data from Work Together NC's research study. Work Together NC is a statewide initiative focused on the transition to adulthood for people with IDD. It aims to improve the quality of life of people with IDD and their families through making it easier to navigate systems of support in the transition to adulthood and to increase access to meaningful work, continued education, and community engagement. So for a little bit of background, literature has shown that disability support services, which are services that provide health, social care, and advocacy for people with IDD, are crucial to promoting health and well-being. Disability support services and programs for individuals with IDD also often aim to improve community participation. However, in a statewide survey, 54% of stakeholder respondents in North Carolina reported a lack of adequate support services across the state. So for our participants in our study, we had 40 adults with intellectual and/or developmental disabilities. Participants range from 19 to 48 years old, with a mean age of around 26 years old. Of note, we began as a study focused on young adults, so ages 18 to 26 only, and then we later expanded to 18 and up. And then participants were around 60% female and 40% male. Participants were primarily white and non-Hispanic, And then using self-report diagnosis information, a majority of our participants were autistic. However, participants also reported diagnoses of intellectual disability, ADHD, learning disability, and cerebral palsy. For our measures, we use self and informant report surveys. We used a demographic survey, which captured information about living circumstances, services received, service needs, and the reported quality of services, both in high school and after high school and adulthood. We also asked about main occupation and recreational activities in that survey. We also used the World Health Organization Quality of Life Disabilities module and the Ways-Man Activities of Daily Living scale. A little more information about the quality of life survey that we used. It asked questions regarding quality of life in various domains, including overall quality of life, physical, psychological, environmental, social, and disability-related quality of life. I'll go ahead and provide some examples just to kind of demonstrate each domain. So a question for overall quality of life included, are you satisfied with your life? For physical, questions like how satisfied are you with your health? For psychological, there were questions like, do you feel your life has meaning? For environmental, there were questions such as, are you satisfied with your access to health services? And for social, we had questions like, are you satisfied with the support you get from your friends? Questions were answered on a 3 or 5 point scale, which you can see here from not at all, moderately, and totally. And we had some little emojis to help with the visual aspect. For the Ways-Man Activities of Daily Living scale, you heard about that earlier in the presentation, but just as a refresher, we use this scale to measure independence in activities of daily living. So we ask questions regarding current level of independence in performing those activities, rated on a 3-point scale from independently, or I do this on my own, to I do this with help, or I do not do this at all. And some item examples include making your own bed, washing and bathing, preparing a complete meal, and then baking and managing daily finances. So some other measures that we collected included global positioning system, or GPS data, and then geographic information system, or GIS data. We also used social diaries and semi-structured interviews. So during the study, participants carried a GPS device everywhere that they traveled in the community for 2 weeks. We then created maps of all the locations that they visited and calculated time spent away from home. We used ArcGIS to create maps of activity spaces, which I'll explain a little more later on. During the 2 weeks that the participants carried the GPS, they filled out those daily social diaries with information about the places they visited, what they're doing there, who they were with, if they required assistance there, and how they got there. Semi-structured interviews were conducted at the second visit following the GPS tracking weeks, and we asked questions about what participants did in the community, important places to them, including those that weren't captured in their GPS data, questions regarding community belonging, such as where do you feel you belong most, and do you feel like you're a part of your community. So a little bit of descriptive data as far as our GPS data. In our analyses, we used 1 week of their data to kind of account for forgetting the GPS at home, which happened often, and other technology issues. You can see an image of our GPS device called the Trackie. And so we looked at unique locations, and by unique locations, I mean that each new place that the participant visited, a lot of times participants would go to the same location for multiple reasons, and so that would only be the one unique location, but you could go to 3 Walmarts located on different streets, and that would be 3 unique locations. We had a large range, as you can see, of unique locations, so we had participants that visited 3 in 1 week, and a participant who visited 61 unique locations in 1 week. However, our mean fell around 16 locations in a week. We looked at 2 measures of time spent away from home, so the total hours they spent away from home for the week, and then the mean total hours away from home per day during that week. For total hours per week, again, large range, 2.65 hours to 96.6 hours. We did have one participant who was a bit of an outlier. He obviously did a lot of stuff away from home. But our mean for this measure was about 31 hours. For mean total hours per day, this ranged from 0.38 hours, that's 22.8 minutes, to 13.8 hours. The mean for that measure was 4.5 hours. So this is a little more about ArcGIS. So using ArcGIS, we calculated the participants' activity spaces, which is the square mileage of how far they traveled to these locations over the week. You can see we have another big range of 0.15 miles to 1,183 miles. And kind of note with this, we asked participants to track during a typical week for them. Usually that excludes traveling, but for some people, traveling is part of their normal routine. And so the mean here was about 275.8 square miles. To the right, you can see an example of what these activity spaces look like in ArcGIS. So each colored circle is a different participant, and the circles capture that area that they traveled to during the week. So next, for our data analysis, we used linear mixed models to analyze the associations between daily living skills, services received, unmet service needs, number of unique locations, activity space, and quality of life. So for what we found an association between receiving vocational services in adulthood and higher overall physical and social quality of life. We found an association between needing mental health services in adulthood and lower overall psychological and social quality of life. There was an association between needing transportation services in adulthood and lower environmental quality of life. There was also an association between higher daily living skills and higher overall and physical quality of life. And lastly, we found an association between a fewer number of unique locations visited and higher quality of life on the disabilities domain, as well as psychological quality of life. Out of note, activity space was not associated with any variables. This may indicate that the geographic spread of activities is less important than the specific nature of the activities and the support received during community participation. So what does all of this mean? Our study incorporates objective measures like GPS data and subjective measures of our surveys to provide a nuanced understanding of community participation and well-being for adults with IDD. We know that individuals with IDD experience at least the same prevalence of mental health disorders as the general population and may be more susceptible to certain conditions. Our results show that the shortage of mental health providers with expertise in serving people with IDD has tangible consequences for this population. The relationship between transportation limitations and lower environmental quality of life suggests that mobility constraints shape how individuals with IDD perceive and interact with their surroundings and potentially limits their ability to access community resources. This highlights a need for improved transportation services with individuals with IDD. Our GPS tracking data revealed an unexpected relationship. Adults who visited fewer unique locations reported higher disability-related and psychological quality of life. This finding challenges assumptions that more extensive community participation necessarily translates to better outcomes. Instead, it suggests that the potential value of routine and predictability for adults with IDD who may benefit from regular engagement with a smaller set of familiar, comfortable, and meaningful locations. Then we also found that the independence and daily living skills are associated with higher well-being, supporting expansion and use of daily living skills interventions to to promote the highest quality of life for adults with IDD. As far as limitations in our study, we had a relatively small sample size of 40 participants who completed the study. We had small representation of rural communities. Most of our participants were living in the Triangle region of North Carolina. For those outside of North Carolina, that's Raleigh, Chapel Hill, Durham. Our participants were mostly white and non-Hispanic, and we couldn't control for other life factors that may have affected community participation, such as health conditions during our study. So implications for policy and practice. Our research supports the expansion of vocational rehabilitation services for adults with IDD, as we see access is associated with quality of life. There's an urgent need for integrated mental health services designed specifically for adults with IDD. And then, as mentioned previously, there's a need for expanded transportation services to improve mobility within the community and improve quality of life. Further research should incorporate longitudinal designs to examine changes in mobility patterns over time and include more diverse representation across rural communities and other racial and ethnic groups. And that is it. Thank you, of course, to all of our amazing participants and the collaborators on the Work Together NC project, and our funder, the Department of Health and Human Services Administration for Community Living.
For staying with us. So I think you all heard some unique methods that were used, at least I did in each of the talks. And so I have a couple of questions. Also, here's a cue in case you want to remember the quiz I assigned you at the start of our presentations to remind us what levels we were talking about across all 4 talks. So I wanted to give our panel a chance to reflect on some of the methods that each of them used that were a little unique. And so if each of you could maybe think about describing one experience and implementing these kind of different novel methods across the socioecological model and then in your studies.
I think you should go first.
Yeah, so with the GPS methods, it's a big example of looking at the individual and their relationship with the environment. So we saw lots of ranges of community participation based on, if someone is living in a more rural area versus the Triangle has lots of resources, and how they're able to, their community participation changes with their access to environmental factors like transportation.
I'm not totally sure if this is across the sociological model per se, but I can reflect a little bit on sort of doing the social support interviews, and this probably applies to some of the things that Leanne talked about as well. Who you get your information from and how you design your protocols to be inclusive, I think can be a real challenge. So we really wanted to get self-report, and we also wanted to include as wide of a range as possible and be really inclusive. And what that meant was that there were some autistic adults who could report beautifully and easily on everything that was going on in their lives, and maybe their informant was, we didn't talk much about informant, sorry. But maybe it was like a roommate or even a spouse. And then there were some autistic adults that were eligible for our study but had a really hard time reporting on these things, and the informant was the parent who could provide better information potentially than the roommate or the spouse in the other situations. And so we've reflected a lot, I think, in our study about, figuring out the right methods for the right people to get the best data possible about a group that you're interested in. And I don't think we have answers for that, but I think that's something that I've been thinking about a lot, especially when wanting to really do more in-depth interviews and really get as much information as possible about someone's life circumstances from the person with the disability or the autistic adult themselves. Doesn't really answer your question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I follow up? I said follow up. So we've kind of run into some of the similar things. with especially the self-report surveys and that kind of thing. How do you know if participants were including like reminders to do personal care activities or reminders to do things as help for that activity, or was it? Do you get the sense that it was just generally an interpretation when someone was there physically doing it with them, whether that counted as help?
I would say we have one of our project managers in the room that has, not to put you on the spot, Iman, she has talked to many of the adults in the study. And so was your sense for like, if somebody was sort of doing prompting and different things like that, were they counting that as help, or was it really somebody who was sort of physically assisting them with the task?
I do think quite a few informants brought up reminders being that form of support. However, a lot of folks did not specify the kinds of support that they were providing too, so that's a little unclear, but reminders were definitely frequently mentioned as like that kind of support, as well as more in-depth support too.
Real quick, I just want Hayden and Allie have recently done a ton of Vineland
behaviors.
And so it's not the same studies, but we often recruit from our similar samples. So would you guys say from that they're getting reminders and any thoughts on your many hours and hours of Vineland?
It's a tough question to answer just because I know for like the violence that we did, they were across multiple studies and there were just like so many different types of people who were being described in these violence. But it was definitely, we had a good chunk of folks who, you know, we would ask them the questions that were on the Vineland, and the parent would describe a situation in which their adult that they cared for was independent in tasks because they were able to use things like the alarm on their phone and looking at the clock that was positioned over the TV that they used to watch their favorite shows and stuff like that. So we definitely saw a lot of that. For sure.
Yeah, and I know in the ones that I've done, they also say, well, yeah, they do that when I remind them or when I leave them a list.
Yeah, there's a lot of that too.
Yeah. Haley Miller from University of Michigan. Thanks for a really interesting set of talks. My question kind of builds on Nick's, I guess, which is, among the participants that you all talk to and the other work that you're doing, what do you think the role of body doubling is of support in this? So now, I'll say in full disclosure, my husband's autistic and can do laundry physically, independently. He's a lawyer, he can do his laundry. But he will do it much more regularly, much faster if we're doing it together. I doubt that he would affirm that as help in this type of thing, right? Like if you were to ask him overtly, are you getting help with this? No. But in conversations, we've discussed that it is helpful when we choose to do tasks together because of the role of body doubling.
Yeah, and no one has described that to me, but I think what's interesting, and I mentioned, because we do have the informant information, and I felt really strongly for this analysis, I wanted it to be from the autistic adults saying who is helping them, especially because we were interested in their own reports of their mental health, and I wanted, but when you look at the informant report, it's very similar. The patterns of findings are the same, but informants are reporting more help that they are, which is actually we all do this. Like you ask anyone, how much do you help in your marriage? Well, I'm helping more than so that's sort of like part of human psychology. But the informants indicate they are providing more help, and it may be some of what you're describing. It's this side by side, making sure the tasks are getting completed. And one of the differences between the WAEL measure and some other measures is that you do. It's sort of like that you're doing the task, not that you can. And I think that, but we never know how well people are really understanding the instructions and how they're interpreting. But I think that's a really important point and not something that we specifically probe. But I think that difference between what informants say, the amount of tasks that they're supporting, versus the autistic adults' interpretation or what they are feeling constitutes support, right? So, and I don't think anyone is right or wrong in this either, right? That, I think that all of those perspectives are valid, and sort of these associations, I think, are important too.
I had a quick question. Your thought or your statement about your husband's job made me think about it. Did you get any information about employment status as far as that connection with?
Do we have information on that?
Well, I just was wondering about like how that's associated with like level of independence and mental health.
And your GIS data.
Yeah.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So the study is about, like the main point, the study is about employment. And sort of the purpose of the study is to track employment stability and instability over time. So poor Iman sitting in front of you probably never wants to see ask another question about employment again, ever. We have really in-depth detail on employment. I think we have not looked yet in this study about associations between daily living skills and employment, but that's super well established in the literature. It's highly related. And I think one of the things that we're interested in is, so we know that it predicts working. Does it predict keeping your job though, or being upwardly mobile? And that's one of the things that we're going to be looking at really carefully in our study over time. So daily living, we have that data. We've got more of that data than we know what to do with. So over the next few years, we're going to be really parsing out and trying to understand how these pieces go together. You're probably more interested in the GIS than the things that I'm talking about.
Yes, so we didn't find any direct association in our study, but I think it is very interesting just to think about beyond employment, meaningful occupation, and how that kind of works with quality of life and mental health. For some people, they didn't want a job. They wanted to go to their daily social groups. So it really just depends on the individual.
Related to that, with the GIS data, I was wondering, we heard a couple days ago in this room a few talks pointing out the importance of fit, like that your neighborhood might be great, but if it's not good for you, then it doesn't matter. So I'm wondering, when you were talking about the GIS data and going to more places and stuff like that, did you guys capture information about how people feel about that? Like how many places they wanted to go, that sort of thing?
I think we saw a lot of that in our semi-structured interviews. Do you feel like a part of your community? So there were many people who said, no, I don't feel like a part of my community. I don't go out and do things with people. And it's interesting that you talk about the neighborhood aspect, because there's this neighborhood in the Triangle area where it's so good for adults with IDD because they can reach everything in walking distance. And we actually had multiple participants that lived there and they loved it. And they had such great things to say about their community because it was all walkable for them. So yeah.
And I just want to say, we haven't even gotten into interview or analyzing those interviews. That's anecdotal from Allie doing all of them. But Dr. Chan and the audience just got us our last activity spaces in GIS, so we're just getting started to kind of look at these mixed methods and start to ask these questions and delve a little bit deeper into employment, because I think, we're really interested in that. Yeah.
Hi, I love this series of talks. It was so illuminating. I have a question, thinking about this model, right? And about the measures that were used, and that societal ideologies, norms, and values actually, I think, is driving some of the measures that were used that then collected data that presented certain things. And I wondered specifically about the ADL scale. In particular, the type of rating that was used is really about, do they do it not at all, with help, or independently, is already putting some assumptions around whether or not that thing is important to the person at all to perform in the first place. And so as an occupational therapist, I remember being trapped in a subject trained by somebody who found out I was an OT and said, I had a stroke and I was in a facility and you OTs made me make my bed over and over and over. And I didn't want to make my bed. I don't make my bed in my daily life. I don't care about making my bed. And why did you make me make my bed as an OT? And I was like, I'm sorry. But, it made me think, you had making a bed there. And if it's not important, do they need help at all? Yes, no, probably not. But what are they going to say if it's not even an option to say if it's important? So those societal values have driven the scale development, and there isn't an option for people to say that. So I just wondered about how our societal values are driving our measures, which then influence the data we're collecting, and is that an option? And then I have a second.
Okay, then yeah, that's great. I will
And I
respond.
had a thought about the relationship between mental health and those sort of independence. And I wondered if it was related to this idea of choice and self-determination, and how many autistic people say people infantilize them and they may not have been given the opportunity to do the things that they want to do, and their parents just do it for them. And so is it that this experience and this relationship, their parents haven't given them the opportunity to do things that they can do, or maybe want to do, or maybe don't want to do, and how that's driving their either learned helplessness or not in that situation as an adult and doing things. I don't know. Just
Yeah, I'd say I've had all the same thoughts, so this is great. And that I think a lot about, as a developmentalist, sort of how these unfold over time, and why I'm really just sort of dissatisfied with talking about cross-sectional data, because we don't really know the chicken or egg, or what's driving these, you know, sort of associations or patterns, but we don't know, as some of these individuals that are living with a parent don't live with a parent in the future, which is the trend we see in other data will happen for a lot of them, sort of what that means for their patterns of daily living activities. And do more people then choose not to have some of these things done, or do they find other sources of support to complete them because they are of value to them? I don't know. I will say one thing about the development of these items. Often in developmental disability space, when we study adults, we take measures that were done with children and then age them up. And this particular set of items actually came the other way. So these are from the gerontology field around caring for elders that are needing support, and so then using them. So we've aged these items down. So I guess I think that's important to think about, that the sort of the help and the questions and the sort of the ideologies or the norms are coming from like stroke patients. So back to this is the bed port, and the items that we found where people were not completing them, whether they wanted to or not or whatever, and they weren't getting help or support for them, really were these household tasks, and making the bed was one of the top things. And so making the bed, which I think to me does feel very much like a personal preference, or setting the table, clearing the table, sort of the dishes issue, which again, like a person is a personal preference. And so then I might, not care at all about that, except that those are the folks that are really demonstrating of the whole sample, the most elevated mental health symptoms. And so what's going on there, right? Like, is it that making the bed makes you not depressed? Probably not, but there may be something about routine and sort of the integration of people in your life, or I don't know, but yeah. So.
Teal, it's such a good point in that, I mean, just to jump on to what Leanne was saying, that's why we're so intrigued by that finding, because when we looked at the areas where people weren't getting the help they needed, not for everybody, but for a lot of people, it was kind of like, well, so what? I don't make my bed every day. I could, but I don't. But yet, there were these really strong and consistent associations with physical health and mental health. And again, is it because you're not making the bed? Maybe not, but it feels like there's something going on there that we need to dig in and find out. So, the comment that you went through was sort of exactly the thinking and the thing that we've been trying to figure out. But there seems like there's something there, whatever that is, and so we're going to try to delve into that and figure it out.
could it be that the parents are creating a situation as children and not providing that opportunity to do and to be, engaged in whatever task they find valuable and are doing for, and that contributes to this sort of idea of learned helplessness, like I can't cook on my own, my parents have never let me cook, they don't think I'm safe, I'm just not gonna do it. And so, I just wonder about how, and that's where the longitudinal data would be good, but backing it up to childhood where parents are doing for, not doing with, and we're promoting competence or feelings of pride or whatever choice, whatever that is.
And anecdotally, I definitely have heard that from autistic adults, right? That they were never mom is so obsessed with how the laundry is done, I can't even begin to
Or I've been in an assessment where the adult's like, yeah, I'm interested in learning more about finance management, and the parent's like, oh, I didn't know that. But it is lunchtime, so I don't want to hold you guys. Thank you so much. Feel free to ask us more questions. We love talking about all of our projects.